I didn't choose to become a nun at 16 because of some divine calling. Truth is, I was running away from my alcoholic father, from the boys who looked at me too long at school, from a small town that felt like it was squeezing the life out of me with each passing day. Holy Spirit of Mercy Convent in Pinewood, Maine seemed like salvation back in 1969. Stone walls covered in ivy, gardens that smelled of lavender and rosemary, and the quiet rhythm of prayer that structured our days. Mother Elizabeth welcomed me with open arms, her weathered face crinkled when she smiled, her gray eyes warm behind wire-rimmed glasses. "The convent chooses its daughters, Margaret," she told me that first day, "and it seems it has chosen you." I quickly formed a bond with four other young women, Sophia, Anna, Victoria, and Grace. We were all there for different reasons, but united in our desire for purpose and peace. Sophia with her musical laugh and nimble fingers that could coax melodies from the old chapel piano. Anna, serious and studious, who knew Latin better than the priest. Victoria, fierce and protective, the oldest among us. And Grace, gentle Grace, with her gift for growing things, turning the convent garden into a small paradise. For 3 years, our lives followed the same comforting pattern: morning prayers, work in the garden or kitchen, study, evening prayers. I taught at the small school attached to the convent, discovering a love for sharing knowledge with children. For the first time in my life, I felt safe, respected, at home. Then Father Thomas Richardson arrived in the spring of 1972. I still remember the day he came, tall and broad-shouldered with a booming voice and what Mother Elizabeth called city manners. He smiled too widely, laughed too loudly, and his eyes lingered too long on us younger nuns. But he came with glowing recommendations from the diocese, and we were taught to respect the clergy above all. The changes were subtle at first. Father Thomas insisted on private confessions rather than the open-door policy Mother Elizabeth had always maintained. He found reasons to summon us individually to his office for spiritual guidance. He began appearing in places he had no reason to be: the dormitory hallways after dark, the garden when Grace was working alone, the library when Anna was studying. Victoria was the first to say something. "He cornered me in the supply closet," she whispered one night when we gathered in the kitchen. "He said he wanted to test my devotion." Her hands trembled as she spoke. "He told me my pride was a sin," Anna added, her voice barely audible. "Said I needed special penance." One by one, we shared our experiences. Uncomfortable comments, accidental touches, moments when we felt trapped or frightened. Sophia had stopped playing the piano because he would stand too close behind her. Grace avoided the garden when she knew he was in the convent. I went to Mother Elizabeth immediately, but found her bedridden with pneumonia. "She needs rest," Sister Agnes, her assistant, told me firmly. "The doctor says no visitors, no upset." Without Mother Elizabeth's protection, Father Thomas grew bolder. He began calling me to his office regularly, claiming concerns about my teaching. The day he locked the door behind me was the day I realized how much danger we were all in. "You've been filling the other girls' heads with lies about me," he said, his voice dangerously soft. "Perhaps you need a reminder of your vows of obedience." I managed to slip past him that day, but knew it was only a matter of time. That night, I gathered the others in the bell tower, the one place we knew he never went because of his fear of heights. "We need to report him," Victoria insisted, "right to the bishop." "With what proof?" Anna asked, practical as always. "My word against a priest?" I shook my head. "We know how that ends." What we didn't know then was that our decision that night would change everything, not just for us, but for dozens of women who would come after us. As we huddled together in that cold tower, none of us could have imagined the path that lay ahead or the price we would pay for our freedom. But the first step was clear. We had to escape.
Victoria took charge of our escape plan with the same intensity she brought to everything. "We need an ally on the outside," she said, pacing our small circle in the bell tower. "Someone with transportation who won't report us." Grace spoke up, her voice surprisingly steady. "Daniel Miller, the vegetable supplier. He's seen things. The way Father Thomas behaves, I think he would help us." Daniel was a quiet man in his 40s who delivered produce to the convent twice weekly. He rarely spoke more than necessary, but his eyes were kind, and he always had extra berries for our kitchen hidden at the bottom of his crates. I was chosen to approach him during his next delivery. My heart pounded so hard I thought it might break through my ribs as I slipped him a note while accepting a crate of potatoes. He read it, glanced around, and gave a single subtle nod before walking away. 3 days later, as a spring storm lashed against the windows, we met Daniel behind the convent's north wall, where a section had crumbled years ago, hidden by overgrown ivy. He was waiting with his truck, engine idling quietly, headlights off. "5 of you?" he whispered, counting our huddled forms in the rain. "I thought there were only 4. "We couldn't leave Sophia," Victoria explained, helping our youngest sister over the rough stones. At just 19, Sophia had become increasingly withdrawn since Father Thomas's arrival. Daniel nodded, helping us into the covered bed of his truck. "I've got a cabin, my late mother's place. It's about 50 miles from here. You'll be safe until we figure something out." That night, huddled in Daniel's rustic cabin, we shed our habits, both literally and figuratively. Wrapped in borrowed flannel shirts and blankets, we looked at each other as women, not as nuns, perhaps for the first time. "What have we done?" Anna whispered, horror and exhilaration battling in her voice. "Saved ourselves," Victoria replied firmly. The next morning, Daniel brought us clothes, food, and newspapers. "They're looking for you," he said grimly. "Father Thomas is telling people you've been led astray and need to be returned to guidance." Victoria snorted. "Of course he is." "This is temporary," Daniel continued. "I've got a cousin in North Carolina, Blue Ridge area. He owns land, lots of it, isolated. You'd be safer there, further away." While the others discussed logistics with Daniel, I wandered to the window, watching rain drip from pine branches. Just days ago, I'd been Sister Margaret, secure in my identity and purpose. Now I was... who, exactly? "Margaret," Grace's soft voice broke through my thoughts. "Victoria's suggesting we keep evidence, document everything that happened in case someday..." She didn't finish the sentence. That night, Victoria produced a leather-bound journal. We each write our experiences, everything we remember, dates, times, exactly what he said and did. If we ever get the chance to expose him, we'll need details. One by one, we poured our experiences onto those pages. The inappropriate comments, the unwanted touches, the threats when we tried to avoid him, the way Mother Elizabeth's illness had left us vulnerable. By dawn, we had filled 20 pages with our collective trauma. "This stays with me," Victoria said, wrapping the journal carefully and placing it in her bag. "Someday, someone will listen." We left for North Carolina the following night, crammed into Daniel's truck for the long journey south. None of us looked back at the main landscape disappearing behind us. We were moving forward. Toward what? We didn't yet know. What we couldn't possibly have understood then was how completely our lives would fracture and reform over the coming decades, or that the journal Victoria guarded so carefully would eventually become the key to a reckoning none of us thought possible.
The Blue Ridge Mountains became our sanctuary. Daniel's cousin Matthew owned nearly 100 acres of wooded land, with a small cabin tucked away from the main road. He asked no questions when Daniel explained we needed a place to stay, just nodded and said, "Folks round here mind their business." We created new identities with Daniel's help. I became Mary Wilson, a widow from New Hampshire. Victoria was Sarah Collins, my sister-in-law. Anna, Grace, and Sophia became cousins, with different last names, but a shared story about leaving an abusive family situation. Matthew found his jobs in the nearby town, small positions where people didn't ask too many questions. I worked at a local library, Anna at a grocery store, Victoria as a seamstress, Grace at a plant nursery, and Sophia as a waitress. We pooled our meager earnings, saving every spare penny. After 6 months, we had enough to rent a small house on the outskirts of town. After a year, we had established ourselves enough that neighbors stopped viewing us with suspicion. We became known as quiet, hardworking women who kept to themselves, but were always ready to help when needed. But beneath our carefully constructed normalcy, the trauma remained. Sophia had nightmares that left her screaming into her pillow. Anna developed a fear of men in authority that made her physically ill around police officers or doctors. Grace would freeze when touched unexpectedly. Victoria's anger simmered just below the surface, erupting in private moments of rage. And me? I became the keeper of our story. Each night, I added to Victoria's journal, documenting not just what had happened at the convent, but what continued to happen to us. The lasting effects of Father Thomas's abuse and the system that had protected him instead of us. "What's the point?" Anna asked one evening, finding me writing by lamplight. "No one will ever read it. No one will ever believe us over a priest." Maybe not now, but someday the world might be different. As years passed, we slowly built new lives. Grace fell in love with a local widower and married him after telling him a version of our truth. Anna went back to school, eventually becoming a teacher. Sophia found her voice again through art, painting landscapes that captured both the beauty and isolation of our mountain refuge. Victoria never stopped being vigilant, checking newspapers from Maine, keeping tabs on Holy Spirit from afar. She was the first to learn that Mother Elizabeth had died 2 years after our escape. "The convent's under new leadership," she told us, "a Mother Josephine." "Is he still there?" Sophia asked quietly. We never spoke Father Thomas's name. Victoria nodded grimly. "From what I can gather, yes." 10 years into our new lives, Grace was the first to leave us. Cancer took her quickly, a cruel mercy in some ways. On her deathbed, she made me promise something. "If you ever get the chance to tell our story, tell all of it. Don't let what happened to us happen to anyone else." I watched the light fade from her eyes, clutching her hand as she slipped away. That night, I added her death to our journal, another consequence of a system that had forced us into hiding rather than delivering justice. What none of us realized then was that our story was only half written, and that the journal documenting our suffering would eventually find its way into hands powerful enough to bring about the reckoning we'd stopped believing was possible. By 1987, 15 years after our escape, we'd scattered across 3 different states. Victoria and I remained in North Carolina, but Anna had moved to Virginia for a teaching position, and Sophia had followed her artistic pursuits to a small coastal town in South Carolina. We stayed in contact through letters and occasional visits, our shared past an invisible thread connecting us across the miles. Victoria kept the journal, adding to it whenever new information about Holy Spirit reached her through her network of carefully cultivated contacts. "He's been promoted," she told me during one of our monthly dinners. Her fork clattered against her plate as her hand trembled with rage. "Father Thomas is now Monsignor Richardson, overseeing 3 parishes in Maine." I felt sick. How many others since us? I whispered. I don't know, Victoria admitted. But I've heard rumors. Nothing concrete enough to take action. We tried once, in 1978, to report him. Victoria had written an anonymous letter to the bishop detailing some of Father Thomas's behavior. The response had been swift. A formal statement from the diocese denouncing malicious rumors and reaffirming their complete confidence in Father Thomas's character and leadership. In 1990, we lost Anna. A car accident on an icy Virginia road took her instantly. At our funeral, Victoria, Sophia, and I stood together, 3 remaining pieces of a broken circle. She never stopped being afraid, Sophia said softly as we watched Anna's coffin lowered into the ground. Even with all her accomplishments, all her education, she never stopped looking over her shoulder. Victoria died in 1999, lung cancer, though she never smoked a day in her life. Environmental factors, the doctor suggested with a shrug. In her final weeks, she made me promise to keep the journal. It's all in here, she whispered, pressing the worn leather book into my hands. Everything. Someday, Margaret, someday, someone will listen. By 2000, only Sophia and I remained of our original 5. We'd both passed 50, our youth left far behind in that stone convent in Maine. I moved to South Carolina to be closer to Sophia, taking a position to a community college library. The world was changing. News reports began to surface about priests being accused of misconduct, of abuse. Some cases dated back decades. People were starting to listen, to believe. Do you think, Sophia asked one evening as we watched a news report about a Boston investigation into clerical abuse? I don't know, I answered honestly. But for the first time, I think it might be possible. In 2007, I received a letter from Pinewood, Maine. The return address made my hands shake so badly I dropped the envelope. Holy Spirit of Mercy Convent. Inside was a short note from someone named Father Michael Barnes, recently assigned to the parish. I've heard rumors, he wrote. If you are who I think you are, I would like to speak with you. I promise to listen. After 35 years of silence, someone was finally offering to hear our story. But could I trust him? Or was this some elaborate trap? That night, I opened Victoria's journal for the first time in years and began to read through our collective testimony, wondering if the time had finally come to speak our truth aloud. I called Father Michael Barnes from a payphone, unwilling to risk my personal number. His voice was younger than I expected, tinged with an earnestness that reminded me painfully of my own naivete decades earlier. I'd like to meet in person, he said, after I cautiously identified myself. I can come to you. No, I replied firmly, neutral ground. We arranged to meet at a hotel conference room in Philadelphia, halfway between us. Sophia insisted on accompanying me, though her health had begun to fail in recent years. We started this together, she said simply. I brought Victoria's journal, now supplemented with my own decades of notes and newspaper clippings, a comprehensive archive of our exile and its consequences. Father Michael was younger than I'd imagined, perhaps in his mid-30s. He wore civilian clothes, jeans and a button-down shirt, rather than clerical attire. Thank you for trusting me enough to meet, he began, his hands clasped on the table between us. I want you to know that I believe you, even before hearing your story. How did you find us? Sophia asked, her voice carrying a tremor that had developed in recent years. Mother Elizabeth's private papers, he explained. They were sealed until recently. She documented her concerns about Father Thomas before her illness, and she wrote about you 5, how worried she was when you disappeared. A lump formed in my throat. After all these years, to learn that Mother Elizabeth had cared, had worried, she suspected what was happening, Father Michael continued, but by the time she recovered enough to act, you were gone, and Father Thomas had convinced everyone you'd run off for less virtuous reasons. For the next 3 hours, Sophia and I shared our story, supplemented by the detailed accounts in Victoria's journal. Father Michael took notes, asked clarifying questions, and most importantly,
never once suggested we might be mistaken or exaggerating. There are others, he said finally, women who've approached me privately since I arrived at Holy Spirit, some from your time, others more recent. The pattern spans decades. Why are you doing this? I asked. You're risking your own position by believing us. He was quiet for a moment. My sister was abused by our parish priest when she was 12. No one believed her. She took her own life when she was 17. His voice cracked slightly. The church I serve should protect the vulnerable, not prey upon them. Over the next 6 months, Father Michael built a case. He gathered testimonies from other victims, documented the pattern of abuse and institutional cover-up, and finally presented everything to the bishop, with copies sent simultaneously to 3 major newspapers. The diocese had no choice but to act. An investigation was launched. Father Thomas, now Monsignor Richardson, was removed from his position pending the inquiry. In the end, the church acknowledged the abuse had occurred. Father Thomas was laicized, stripped of his clerical status, but due to statutes of limitations, he faced no criminal charges. The most they could do was remove him from the priesthood and offer financial settlements to victims who came forward. It wasn't perfect justice, but it was acknowledgement, validation. After 35 years, we were finally believed. The diocese offered us a formal apology and compensation, which we redirected to a fund for other survivors. But most significantly, they offered us the convent property, which had been closed for several years due to declining numbers of nuns. What would we even do with it, Sophia wondered, as we stood outside the stone walls we'd fled so many decades before? The answer came to me with sudden clarity. Transform it. Make it a place of genuine sanctuary. Today, the former Holy Spirit of Mercy Convent houses the Elizabeth Grace Women's Center, named for Elizabeth and Grace's memory. We provide shelter, counseling, education, and support to women escaping all forms of abuse. Sophia oversees our art therapy program when her health permits. I'm 70 now, my hair gray, my hands mapped with veins and age spots. But when I walk these halls, now filled with light and laughter instead of fear and silence, I feel the presence of Victoria, Anna, and Grace. I feel the power of our shared resilience. Truth is faith, I tell the women who come to us. Speaking up is prayer. Silence only serves the oppressor. The Elizabeth Grace Women's Center celebrated its 10th anniversary in 2017. What began as a small refuge with just 3 staff members had grown into a respected institution serving hundreds of women annually. Our waiting list for residential programs stretched months long, a painful reminder of how many women still needed sanctuary. On that anniversary morning, I sat in the garden Grace would have loved, sipping tea and watching volunteers set up for the day's celebration. The convent's grounds, once austere and forbidding, now bloomed with wildflowers and vegetable gardens tended by residents as part of their healing process. A familiar figure made her way slowly toward me, Sophia, now using a walker, her once auburn hair completely white, but her eyes still bright with the same artistic spark. "You're up early," I remarked as she settled carefully onto the bench beside me. "Couldn't sleep," she admitted. "Too many memories stirring." We sat in companionable silence, 2 survivors in their 70s, watching the sun climb higher over the Maine mountains. So much had changed in the decades since we'd reclaimed the space. The tall stone walls that once kept us imprisoned now protected women seeking safety. The chapel where Father Thomas had once conducted Mass was now a community room where women learned job skills and attended therapy sessions. "He's here," Sophia said suddenly, her hand finding mine with surprising strength. I didn't need to ask who. Father Michael Barnes, now in his mid-40s, was making his way through the garden paths. He visited regularly, conducting optional spiritual services for those residents who wanted them, but mostly supporting our work through his connections in the community. He bent to kiss each of our cheeks in greeting. "The guest speaker has arrived," he announced with a smile. "She's remarkable, Margaret. Wait until you hear her speak. The speaker, a former state prosecutor who now advocated for extending statutes of limitations in abuse cases, had become a powerful ally. Her work had already helped change laws in 3 states, allowing more survivors to seek justice regardless of when the abuse occurred. As we made our way to the main hall for the ceremony, I found myself reflecting on the journey that had brought us here. Not just the physical journey from Maine to North Carolina and back again, but the emotional one, from frightened young women to survivors, advocates, and now, in our own way, revolutionaries. The main hall, once the convent's refectory where we'd eaten in mandated silence, was now filled with cheerful conversation. Women of all ages, some current residents, others graduates of our programs, mingled with donors, community supporters, and staff. Our anniversary celebration was scheduled to begin with my speech, something I still found ironic. The shy 16-year-old who'd come to Holy Spirit seeking escape had become a public speaker, telling her story to help others find their voices. As I approached the podium, I saw a face in the crowd that made me freeze. An elderly man, well into his 80s, thin and stooped but unmistakable. Father Thomas Richardson. My heart raced as our eyes met. For a moment I was 16 again, trapped in his office with his hand on my shoulder. Then Sophia was beside me, her frail fingers gripping my arm. "It's okay," she whispered. "We're not alone anymore." I took a deep breath and began my prepared remarks, keeping my eyes fixed on the supportive faces in the audience. I spoke about our journey, about the women we'd helped, about the work still to be done. Throughout my speech, I was acutely aware of his presence, of his eyes on me. When I finished to applause, I watched as he rose shakily to his feet and made his way toward the exit. Without conscious thought, I found myself following him. In the quiet corridor outside the hall, I called out, "Thomas." He turned slowly, his once imposing frame now bent with age. "Margaret," he acknowledged, his voice a shadow of the booming authority it had once carried. "Why are you here?" I asked, surprised by the steadiness of my own voice. "To see what you've built, to see what became of you." "What became of me?" I repeated incredulously. "You mean after you drove us into hiding? After you stole decades of our lives?" He had the audacity to look wounded. "I've been laicized, lost my position, my reputation. Isn't that enough? For what you did to us, to the others after us? No, it's not nearly enough." He shook his head. "I came to make peace, Margaret. I'm dying. Cancer." I felt nothing. Not satisfaction, not pity, certainly not forgiveness. "Peace isn't mine to give you, Thomas. That's between you and whatever God you still believe in." His eyes hardened briefly, a glimpse of the man that had terrorized us. "You were always the troublemaker, even back then." I smiled then, surprising both of us. Yes, and thank God for that. As I watched him shuffle toward the exit, I realized something profound. He no longer had any power over me. The fear, the anger, even the hatred had burned away, leaving only the clear, cool certainty of my own strength. When I returned to the hall, Sophia was waiting. What did he want? Absolution. I didn't give it to him. She nodded, understanding perfectly. Some debts can't be repaid. That evening, after the celebrations ended and the center quieted, I sat alone in my office, once Mother Elizabeth's room, and opened Victoria's journal. I added a final entry describing the day's events, Father Thomas's appearance, and my realization that while justice might remain imperfect, my own healing was complete. As I closed the journal for the last time, I thought about all the women whose stories filled our center, each one on her own journey from victim to survivor, each one finding her voice, her strength, her way forward. And in that moment, I understood that what we'd built here wasn't just a refuge from abuse. It was a testament to the power of speaking truth, to the healing that comes when secrets are brought into the light, and to the communities that form when survivors stand together. I called Father Michael Barnes from a payphone, unwilling to risk my personal number. His voice was younger than I expected, tinged with an earnestness that reminded me painfully of my own naivete decades earlier. "I'd like to meet in person," he said, after I cautiously identified myself. "I can come to you." "No," I replied firmly, neutral ground. We arranged to meet at a hotel conference room in Philadelphia, halfway between us. Sophia insisted on accompanying me, though her health had begun to fail in recent years. "We started this together," she said simply. I brought Victoria's journal, now supplemented with my own decades of notes and newspaper clippings, a comprehensive archive of our exile and its consequences. Father Michael was younger than I'd imagined, perhaps in his mid-30s. He wore civilian clothes, jeans and a button-down shirt, rather than clerical attire. "Thank you for trusting me enough to meet," he began, his hands clasped on the table between us. "I want you to know that I believe you, even before hearing your story." "How did you find us?" Sophia asked, her voice carrying a tremor that had developed in recent years. "Mother Elizabeth's private papers," he explained. "They were sealed until recently. She documented her concerns about Father Thomas before her illness, and she wrote about you five, how worried she was when you disappeared." A lump formed in my throat. After all these years, to learn that Mother Elizabeth had cared, had worried. "She suspected what was happening," Father Michael continued, "but by the time she recovered enough to act, you were gone, and Father Thomas had convinced everyone you'd run off for less virtuous reasons." For the next 3 hours, Sophia and I shared our story, supplemented by the detailed accounts in Victoria's journal. Father Michael took notes, asked clarifying questions, and most importantly, never once suggested we might be mistaken or exaggerating. "There are others," he said finally, "women who've approached me privately since I arrived at Holy Spirit, some from your time, others more recent. The pattern spans decades." "Why are you doing this?" I asked. "You're risking your own position by believing us." He was quiet for a moment. "My sister was abused by our parish priest when she was 12. No one believed her. She took her own life when she was 17. His voice cracked slightly. "The church I serve should protect the vulnerable, not prey upon them." Over the next 6 months, Father Michael built a case. He gathered testimonies from other victims, documented the pattern of abuse and institutional cover-up, and finally presented everything to the bishop, with copies sent simultaneously to 3 major newspapers. The diocese had no choice but to act. An investigation was launched. Father Thomas, now Monsignor Richardson, was removed from his position pending the inquiry. In the end, the church acknowledged the abuse had occurred. Father Thomas was laicized, stripped of his clerical status, but due to statutes of limitations, he faced no criminal charges. The most they could do was remove him from the priesthood and offer financial settlements to victims who came forward. It wasn't perfect justice, but it was acknowledgement, validation. After 35 years, we were finally believed. The diocese offered us a formal apology and compensation, which we redirected to a fund for other survivors. But most significantly, they offered us the convent property, which had been closed for several years due to declining numbers of nuns. What would we even do with it, Sophia wondered, as we stood outside the stone walls we'd fled so many decades before? The answer came to me with sudden clarity. Transform it. Make it a place of genuine sanctuary. Today, the former Holy Spirit of Mercy Convent houses the Elizabeth Grace Women's Center, named for Elizabeth and Grace's memory. We provide shelter, counseling, education, and support to women escaping all forms of abuse. Sophia oversees our art therapy program when her health permits. I'm 70 now, my hair gray, my hands mapped with veins and age spots. But when I walk these halls, now filled with light and laughter instead of fear and silence, I feel the presence of Victoria, Anna, and Grace. I feel the power of our shared resilience. Truth is faith, I tell the women who come to us. Speaking up is prayer. Silence only serves the oppressor.
The Boston Center opened in spring 2019, a renovated Victorian in Dorchester with rooms for 15 women and their children. I attended the ribbon-cutting ceremony despite my doctor's concerns about my recent diagnosis of early-stage heart failure. "Some things are worth the risk," I told Dr. Palmer when she cautioned against travel. "This is one of them." Eliza managed the event flawlessly. At 35, she had grown into a formidable advocate with political connections I could never have cultivated. Under her guidance, the Elizabeth Grace name had become synonymous with both compassionate care and unflinching accountability. The Boston Center's director, a survivor named Jasmine who'd once stayed at our main location, gave me a tour of the facilities. Each bedroom was named after a woman who'd contributed to our mission. I felt my throat tighten when she showed me the Sophia Room, decorated with framed reproductions of my friends' paintings. "And this," Jasmine said, opening double doors to a sunlit space filled with bookshelves, comfortable chairs, and a large table, "is the Margaret Wilson Library and Meeting Room." I hadn't expected this recognition, hadn't wanted it, but seeing the space, designed for education, for sharing stories, for building community, I understood it as a continuation rather than a monument. That evening, sitting in my hotel room, I experienced a strange doubling of time, as if my 16-year-old self and my 73-year-old self were somehow occupying the same moment. What would that frightened girl think of the journey ahead? Would knowing the pain make the purpose seem worth it? I was interrupted by a knock at my door. Eliza stood there with a folder in her hands, her expression uncharacteristically hesitant. She said, "There's something I need to show you. We've been contacted by a woman named Rachel Donahue. She was at Holy Spirit in the 1980s, long after you left." She handed me the folder. Inside was a letter from Rachel describing her own abuse at Holy Spirit, not by Father Thomas, but Mother Josephine, the woman who'd replaced Mother Elizabeth. "There were others," Rachel wrote. "Mother Josephine's cruelty was different from Father Thomas's, but no less damaging. She used humiliation, isolation, psychological torture. When we tried to report her, we were dismissed as troublemakers, just as you were." I read the letter twice, feeling an old, familiar anger rekindling. The system hadn't changed as much as we'd hoped, just the particular manifestations of its abuses. "She wants to meet you," Eliza said. "All of them do. There are 7 women who've come forward." By fall 2019, we'd established a new initiative, the Generational Healing Project. Women from different eras of Holy Spirit's history sharing their experiences, documenting patterns of abuse that span decades, and working together to demand institutional accountability that went beyond individual perpetrators. Rachel Donahue became a powerful partner in this work, nearly 30 years my junior, but with the same determined spirit Victoria had possessed. She helped us trace how abusive systems perpetuated themselves, even as individuals within them changed. "It was never just about Father Thomas," she explained during one of our strategy sessions. "It was about a structure that gave him power without accountability, that valued institutional reputation over individual suffering." My health continued to decline gradually, but I refused to step back from this new chapter in our advocacy. If anything, the knowledge that my time was limited gave me a renewed sense of urgency. In early 2020, as news of a spreading virus began to dominate headlines, we accelerated our plans for the Vermont and South Carolina centers. Construction had barely begun on both facilities when the world shut down in March. The pandemic created new challenges for our work. Domestic violence rates surged as victims were tracked with abusers during lockdowns. Our centers quickly adapted, developing virtual support groups and hotline services while maintaining physical shelter for those in immediate danger. During those isolated months, I found myself returning to Victoria's journal frequently, drawing strength from her words across the decades. The work of justice is never finished in a single generation, she had written in 1982. What matters is that we keep passing the torch. By summer 2021, as vaccinations made gathering possible again, the Generational Healing Project had grown to include 37 women whose experiences at Holy Spirit spanned from 1965 to its closing in 2005. Their collective testimony painted a damning picture of systemic failure spanning decades. We presented our findings to the current Bishop of Maine in September 2021. Unlike his predecessors, Bishop Reynolds listened without defensiveness, taking notes and asking clarifying questions. "What do you want the church to do?" he asked when we'd finished. Rachel and I exchanged glances before I answered. Acknowledge the full scope of what happened, not just individual bad apples, but the systemic failures that enabled them. Commit to structural changes that ensure real accountability and provide resources for healing to all survivors, regardless of when the abuse occurred. The resulting diocesan response wasn't perfect, but it represented progress, an acknowledgement of institutional failure, a commitment to structural reforms, including lay oversight of abuse allegations, and significant financial support for our centers. As 2022 dawned, I celebrated my 75th birthday quietly at the main center, surrounded by staff and residents who'd come like family. My heart condition had worsened, limiting my activities but not my determination to see our work continue. The Vermont Center opened in June, followed by the South Carolina facility in August. I attended both openings virtually, my strength no longer permitting travel, but my voice still capable of offering words of encouragement and wisdom. In September, I suffered a minor heart attack that left me further weakened. From my hospital bed, I finalized plans for the Margaret Wilson Legacy Fund, which would ensure financial support for our centers and fellowships long after I was gone. "You need to rest," Dr. Palmer insisted during one of her visits. "Your body needs recovery time." Time is the one thing I'm short on, and there's still work to do.
By the time autumn painted the mountains in brilliant color, I had moved into hospice care in a sunny room overlooking the gardens Grace would have loved. The walls were covered with Sophia's paintings, and Victoria's journal occupied a place of honor on my bedside table. I'd lived long enough to see our work take root, to witness a new generation pick up the mantle of our advocacy. The Elizabeth Grace Centers were no longer just buildings, but a movement, a philosophy of healing that recognized both individual trauma and systemic injustice. As the leaves began to fall, I felt a strange peace settling over me. Not the false peace of silence or surrender that I'd once been taught to value, but the earned tranquility that comes from speaking truth, from turning suffering into purpose. One golden afternoon, as sunlight streamed through my window, I thought I could almost see them, Victoria, Anna, Grace, and Sophia, standing at the foot of my bed, waiting. Not with urgency, but with patient certainty that I would join them when the time was right. "We've done what we could," I whispered to their memory. "We've passed the torch." The wind stirred the curtains gently, and for a moment I was 16 again, stepping through the convent doors for the first time, seeking refuge and purpose. I'd found both, though not in the way I had expected, and in the end, that made all the difference. But the story wouldn't end with me. Across the country, in centers bearing our names, women would continue to find their voices, tell their truths, and transform their suffering into action. Our legacy wasn't in buildings or programs, but in the endless chain of survivors becoming advocates, of silence transforming into powerful testimony. And in that knowledge, I found my final peace. I didn't die that autumn, though the doctors had prepared me for the possibility. Instead, I witnessed one more winter from my hospice room, watching snow blanket the grounds where I'd once fled in terror and later returned in triumph. As 2023 unfolded, my physical world contracted while our movement expanded. From my bed, I participated in video calls with staff at all 4 centers, mentored new fellows in the leadership program, and recorded my memories for the oral history project Rachel had initiated. "Your story needs to be preserved in your own voice," she insisted, setting up recording equipment beside my bed. "Future generations should hear directly from you." Those recording sessions became a final accounting of my life, not just the trauma and escape, but everything that came after. The decades in North Carolina, the slow process of healing, the unexpected second chapter that began when Father Michael reached out in 2007. In May, the diocese announced the establishment of a permanent memorial at Holy Spirit, a meditation garden dedicated to survivors of abuse, designed with input from our Generational Healing Project participants. "Is it enough?" Eliza asked when she brought me the news. "It's never enough," I replied, "but it's acknowledgement, it's visibility. Those are powerful first steps." By summer, I rarely left my bed, my strength ebbing like a slow tide. The staff arranged for my room to be moved to the first floor, with doors opening onto the garden so I could still feel the sun and smell the flowers. Visitors came regularly, former residents whose lives had been transformed at our centers, staff members seeking guidance or simply connection, clergy committed to reform, and journalists documenting our work. I received them all when my strength permitted, passing along whatever wisdom my journey had granted me. In July, an unexpected visitor arrived, a young woman in her 20s with familiar gray eyes behind wire-rimmed glasses. She introduced herself as Elizabeth Barnes and said she was named after Mother Elizabeth. She'd recently been appointed to a Vatican commission on preventing abuse and said her uncle had suggested she speak with me before taking up her position. She said she wanted to understand from my perspective, not just what happened, but what could have prevented it, what should change. I told her about the importance of believing survivors, the danger of institutional self-protection, and the need for transparent processes and genuine accountability. "The Church wants to move past this chapter," Elizabeth admitted. "To say we've addressed it and move on. That's precisely the problem," I replied. "This isn't a chapter to close, it's an ongoing commitment to transformation. Real change happens when protecting the vulnerable becomes more important than protecting the institution." As she was leaving, Elizabeth hesitated at the door. "May I ask you something personal? After everything you experienced, do you still have faith?" I considered the question carefully. "Not in institutions," I finally answered, "but in the divine? Yes, though it looks different than it once did. I believe in a God who stands with the vulnerable against the powerful, who values truth over comfort, who is present in acts of justice and compassion." She nodded slowly. "That's the Church I want to help build." "Then perhaps there is hope after all," I said. August brought the completion of a project particularly dear to my heart, the publication of Breaking Silence, Survivors' Testimonies from Holy Spirit Convent, 1965 to 2005. The volume included excerpts from Victoria's journal, alongside accounts from Rachel's generation and those who came after, creating a 40-year documentation of abuse and resistance. The first copy was delivered to me by Rachel herself, bound in leather reminiscent of Victoria's original journal. She said, "It's done," simply placing it in my hands. "Their voices will be heard." I ran my fingers over the embossed title, thinking of Victoria's insistence that Sunday someone would listen. "She was right," I whispered to her memory. "It just took longer than we hoped." In September, I received a letter from the Vatican acknowledging receipt of our book and confirming that Elizabeth Barnes had presented our recommendations to the Commission. Small steps, perhaps, but unimaginable during those dark days of our escape. As autumn arrived once more, I felt my body failing more rapidly. My heart, which had sustained me through so much, was finally wearing out. I made my peace with this, grateful for the time I've been given to see our work take root. In late October, as crimson and gold leaves drifted past my window, I called Eliza to my bedside for what we both knew might be our final conversation. "I'm not afraid of dying," I told her, my voice barely above a whisper, "but I want you to promise me something." "Anything," she said, her hand warm around mine. "Keep asking the difficult questions. Keep holding institutions accountable. Don't let them reduce this to a historical problem that's been solved." "I promise," she said firmly. "We all do." That evening, as twilight settled over the mountains, I felt a profound sense of completion. Not because our work was finished, it never would be, but because it would continue without me. The seeds we had planted had grown into something self-sustaining, capable of flourishing long after the original gardeners were gone. I closed my eyes, picturing Victoria, Anna, Grace, and Sophia as they'd been that rainy night in 1972, young women with their whole lives ahead of them, climbing over a crumbling wall towards an uncertain future. None of us could have imagined where that journey would lead, the lives we would touch, the changes we would help create. I closed my eyes, picturing Victoria, Anna, Grace, and Sophia as they'd been that rainy night in 1972, young women with their whole lives ahead of them, climbing over a crumbling wall towards an uncertain future. None of us could have imagined where that journey would lead, the lives we would touch, the changes we would help create. "We did it," I whispered to their memory. "We broke the silence." Outside my window, the wind picked up, rustling through fallen leaves, and in that familiar sound, I heard their answer.
I died peacefully on November 12, 2023, just as the first snow of winter began to fall. At least, that's what they tell me happened to my body. But something of Margaret Wilson remains, and the centers that bear our names, and the fellowship program training new leaders, and the book that carries our testimonies, and in the lives of thousands of women who found their own voices after hearing ours. My funeral was held in the garden at the main center, my ashes interred beside Sophia, Victoria, Anna, and Grace, our circle finally complete. Women came from across the country to pay their respects, many bringing their children and even grandchildren. 3 generations of survivors and advocates gathering to honor not just my life, but the movement we'd created together. Father Michael conducted a simple service, weaving together Catholic prayers with readings from our book and testimonials from women whose lives had been touched by our work. Bishop Reynolds attended, as did Elizabeth Barnes, who had just been appointed to a permanent position on the Vatican Commission. Rachel spoke about our first meeting, about the powerful realization that she wasn't alone in her experience. Eliza spoke about the legacy we were all responsible for carrying forward. And a young resident of the Boston Center, barely 20, spoke about finding hope in our story of transformation. 6 months after my death, all 4 Elizabeth Grace Centers participated in a coordinated event to mark the publication of The Next Chapter, a handbook for institutional reform based on our decades of advocacy. The book was sent to every diocese in the country, every seminary, and hundreds of other religious organizations. A year later, Elizabeth Barnes's commission released its recommendations, many drawn directly from our work. For the first time, survivors were given formal roles in oversight and accountability processes within the Church. The change wasn't perfect or complete. Human institutions rarely transform themselves entirely, but it was significant progress from the wall of silence we'd faced in 1972. By 2025, the Elizabeth Grace model had been replicated in 12 states, with centers serving not just survivors of religious abuse, but those escaping domestic violence, trafficking, and other forms of exploitation. Each center maintained our core philosophy: healing requires both personal support and systemic change.
The Margaret Wilson Fellowship expanded to include 20 positions annually, creating a growing network of survivor leaders trained to advocate effectively within religious, educational, and social service systems. Rachel Donahue was appointed to a federal commission on institutional abuse in 2026, bringing our methodology and insights to a national platform. Eliza established an international alliance of survivor-led organizations, sharing resources and strategies across borders. And in Maine, the original Holy Spirit of Mercy Convent, now the Elizabeth Grace Center, continued to evolve. The chapel that had once been Father Thomas's domain became a multi-faith meditation space where women of all spiritual backgrounds could find solace and strength. Mother Elizabeth's office, which had briefly been mine, became a small museum documenting both the history of abuse at Holy Spirit and the movement for justice and healing that grew from it. Victoria's journal occupied a place of honor alongside artifacts from each era of the convent's existence. Children of women who'd found refuge at our centers grew up knowing our names and stories. Some pursued careers in advocacy, law, or counseling, caring for the work we'd begun. Others simply lived with a heightened awareness of both the reality of abuse and the possibility of transformation. 50 years after our escape, in 2072, a scholarly conference was held at the Maine Center to examine the long-term impact of survivor-led movements for institutional accountability. Academics and advocates from around the world gathered to discuss how the Elizabeth Grace model had influenced approaches to addressing abuse across religious, educational, and healthcare systems. By then, none of us who had climbed over that wall in 1972 remained alive in body. But our influence continued to ripple outward, touching lives we could never have imagined reaching. This is what remains when the body fails. Not monuments or accolades, but ideas that take root in other minds, courage that inspire other hearts, truth that empower other voices. Our story became part of a larger narrative of survivors reclaiming their power and transforming their suffering into action. In the end, our greatest legacy wasn't in building safe havens, though that work mattered deeply. It was in challenging the systems that make such havens necessary, and demonstrating that true healing requires not just support for victims, but accountability for perpetrators and the institutions that shield them. What began as 5 terrified young women fleeing in the night became a movement that changed countless lives, not because we were exceptional, but because we refused to be silenced, because we believed, even in our darkest moments, that someday someone would listen. And they did. They still do. They always will. That's the power of breaking silence. It echoes far beyond our own lives, calling others to find their voices, tell their truths, and join the endless work of creating a more just world. I am Margaret Wilson. This is my testimony. And though my body has returned to dust, my story continues in every life touched by our work, in every institution transformed by our advocacy, and in every survivor who finds her voice and speaks her truth. The silence is broken, and in that breaking, something new and powerful continues to be born.